Magic in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere is, let's face it, pretty complicated. But it doesn't have to be confusing. And the more one knows about magic in the Cosmere, the more engaging the material becomes. The last video in this series explored the Cosmere-wide concepts of realmatics, investiture, shards, and perpendicularities, drawing from Scadrial's 3 magic systems for examples. I would highly recommend you watch that video before this one, as it lays a great foundation for a deeper understanding of magic in the Cosmere. There's no plot-related spoilers, though the concepts themselves are drawn from multiple books across the Cosmere. This video is much the same, but today we're going to be expanding on our knowledge of the Cosmere's magic systems by delving into the concepts of connection, intent, and how they relate to the planet of Sel. To understand how the magic on Sel works, as well as form a deeper understanding of magic throughout the Cosmere, we're going to take a look at the concepts of connection and intention, and relate them back to the shards that once inhabited the planet Sel. The first term we're going to explore is connection. Connection plays a large role in the magics of the Cosmere, but magic is not required to form connections. Connections are all around our characters in the Cosmere, and everyone has them in one form or another. To give an example of what forms these connections take, we can look at how humans are innately connected to the land they're born in. They can form connections with other humans just from hanging around each other, talking, and working together. There are strong connections between family, friends, and any individuals they spend large amounts of time around. But these aren't the only types of connections in the Cosmere. Connections can also be formed by cognitive aspects between each other. For instance, languages are often connected to the lands that they originate from. One way that people throughout the Cosmere break language barriers is to find ways of artificially connecting to another place through investiture. This connection gives access to the language of the land and allows a user fluent communication ability with the native inhabitants. But not everything about connection is positive. Connection can also tie a person to their home planet. Highly invested individuals are oftentimes tied to the shards that have invested them, and with such a strong connection, it makes it hard to travel off-world. I'll explore this concept more thoroughly when discussing Roshar, as connection is incredibly important there and works in some really interesting ways. There are all sorts of weird exceptions and rules when it comes to connection as a concept, and we'll explore them in that video. For now though, it's important to understand connection as a concept, and how these connection networks form and bond people to each other and to the lands they inhabit. The next concept that we're going to be looking at is intention. Intention is a spiritual concept in the Cosmere having to do with an individual being's will, or, well, intention. It is an essential part of accomplishing magic in the Cosmere. A being has to want to be accessing magic. Knowing more about an individual's magic system makes it easier to access and learn. One does not need to know the exact mechanics of what they're doing to provide an intent, though. While intent allows a being to access investiture, it also plays a role in shaping the manifestation of investiture itself within the bounds of a magic system. It also has special significance on the planet we're talking about today, known to its inhabitants as Sel. We'll get into exactly how intent shapes these magic systems in a bit, but first we'll have to take a look at one more concept, the door, and its relationship to dominion and devotion. Long before any of the events we've seen on Sel, the shards' dominion and devotion settled on the planet. It is unknown how long they resided there before Odium found their planet, but when he showed up, all hell broke loose. Odium managed to mortally wound the vessels of both shards, trapping their collective investiture in Sel's cognitive realm and leaving the vast stores of power directionless. Though Sel no longer contained any vessels to direct the infinite energy of the two shards, the power still lingers in the cognitive realm in dangerous, undulating clouds, and it's searching for a release. Though these shards are now shattered, they are still connected to Sel, and thus spread out across the whole planet's cognitive realm. And though they have no direction, they are still searching for a release, something to guide the power. Somehow, this collected investiture has begun to coalesce into magic systems across Cell's physical realm. But since it is so spread out across the planet, every magic system is innately tied to the land where it originates. Since the collected power of the two shards is searching for direction, each magic system requires symbols to shape and influence the power, a connection to the user's land, and an intention to use the magic. Together, these two trapped shards are known as the door and are accessible in a multitude of ways across the planet. Let's look at all the uses of the door that we are currently aware of across the planet Cell. While we're traveling, we'll also briefly touch on the locations that these magic systems are based around. Our first area of examination is the continent of Opelon, or Cycla depending on which particular empire you ask. There are 4 known invested arts on this continent. We're going to start in the far western city of Elantris, where the city's inhabitants draw magic lines in the air to access the invested art of Aeon Door. The first step in using Aeon Door is to be reborn. Kind of. Elantrians, as the city's inhabitants are known, cease functioning as normal human beings and transform into something greater. Those born in Opelon and are thus connected to it can be chosen by means unknown to undergo the Sheot, which essentially means transformation. When the Sheot comes over an individual, their skin turns silver, their hair white, and in addition to increased mental and physical abilities, they are able to access the door by using symbols connected to the land itself, known as Aeons. Since all magic on Cell is connected to the land it's based in, this starting symbol, Aeon Aeon, resembles the natural landscape of Opelon where Elantris resides. After the initial Aeon is drawn into the air, it can then be modified with other Aeons, evolving into a complex tapestry of glowing shapes drawn into the very air itself. But this is where intent comes in. Each Aeon has to be understood, and the better an Elantrian understands a symbol's meaning, the more powerfully and precisely the Aeon can draw upon the power of the door. Together, Aeons act as a form of magical programming language. They modify and expand each other, and are able to be chained together to create complex systems of connected Aeons. Aeons are just ways of programming the investiture trapped within the cognitive, acting as a sort of controlled release valve for the door. Though it is unknown precisely how a person is chosen to be taken by the Sheot, there are a few known requirements. The person, of course, has to be a native of Opelon, the land around the city of Elantris. Furthermore, the person has to be in Opelon, or the Sheot cannot come over them. Indeed, both the power of the Aeon Door and one's ability to access it fades the farther away from Opelon one gets. The investiture is quite literally connected to the land. And it would appear that this is the case for every magic system that channels the door. That is to say, every magic system on the planet. Speaking of other uses of the door, let's take a look at some of the other forms it's channeled through on the Opelonian continent. To the south of Opelon lies the nation of Jindo. Very little is known about the nation itself, other than that it was once a free state that was swallowed up by the Fjordell Empire in one of their many wars of expansion. The manifestation of investiture that we've seen from this region is known as Cheishan, or in other words, magic dancing, because that's literally what it is. Practitioners of Cheishan channel the door through a meditative form of martial arts, building speed and power as they do. The door itself is being accessed through the various Cheishan forms and movements, but the exact extent of the abilities that can be accessed is unknown. It's basically the lame earthbenders from the Last Airbender movie, but way cooler and far more effective. Oh, also you can see a faint glow coming off the martial artists once they build up enough speed and power. Moving to the north, we have the more gruesome invested art of Dakor. Practiced by the Dakor monks of Fjorden, the magic system Dakor contorts the very bones of its practitioners into twisted symbols, somehow linked to the land it originates from. Though the bones are twisted and bent, The practitioner is still able to move around somewhat normally, and Dakor monks typically use large robes to cover their various deformities. Depending on the shapes that a priest's bones are warped into, different abilities are granted, though we're going to have to wait for an Elantris sequel to get any further information on the actual mechanics of this system. So far, we know nothing of the chant supposedly used to warp the bones, nor do we know anything of the symbols that the bones are warped into. The final, most gruesome aspect of Dakor that we're going to look at is the monk's ritual sacrifices. A monk chooses to accomplish a particularly extreme task, say, teleporting large groups of people, and gives their very body and soul as a sacrifice to accomplish that goal. I cannot wait to know more about this particular system, as there is much that we have yet to discover about it. The final invested art we know of on this continent is based out of Rovel, and is based on invested elixirs. And that's about everything we know of this magic system. We have no idea how they're created, what they can do, or how the potions access the door, if it accesses it at all. We don't even know what this magic system is called. Before we move off the continent of Opelon, we should talk about an interesting phenomenon, the Seons and Skaze. Both are sentient bits of investiture that reside around Opelon, hovering in the air and forming simple bonds with individuals. We'll dive far deeper into the concepts of both sentience investiture and bonds in my next Realmatics video, currently slated to be about Roshar's magic systems. But for now, you should understand that both Seons and Skaze are completely sentient, connecting to a person and following that person around. And though they tend to follow the will of an individual, both Seons and Skaze have wills of their own, and are not afraid to act upon them. How they choose an individual to bond with is unknown, but it would appear that the bond can be passed to others relatively easily. Both Seons and Skaze are forming relatively shallow bonds with individuals, especially compared to other sentient investiture such as Roshar's Spren. Seons allow their bonded to communicate with another individual with a Seon bond. This can happen over vast distances and between realms instantaneously, and appears to even work off-planet. It is unknown if Skaze possess a similar ability, though it does seem likely. Seons are splinters of devotion, and appear as shining glass balls with a unique glowing aeon inside. Skaze, on the other hand, are splinters of dominion, appearing much the same way, but with rings of currently unknown, misty symbols circling them in place of one singular aeon. The full extent of these beings' abilities is not known, but we should look forward to learning more about Seons, Skaze, and their origins in the sequel to Elantris. Let's move to the northwest and explore the magics of a continent we know very little about, the continent of the Rose Empire. Located vaguely northwest of Opelon, the Rose Empire exists in a sort of willful ignorance of the two other empires that reside on Sel. We've only seen them in one short story, The Emperor's Soul. But in this short story, we learn all about the invested art of forgery as well as blood sealing. Forgery is the weirdest invested art we've seen by far, though the one I find most fascinating to study. Forgery is another location-based Celish magic system that makes use of invested magic stamps to trick an object into thinking it's another object. All stamps are traditionally carved into a material called soulstone, a chalky, solid white substance speckled with red flecks that will harden if held over a fire. It's useful to forgers because of how precisely one can carve into the stone before the hardening process, since extreme precision is necessary. To properly forge an object, one has to figure out a way to plausibly trick the cognitive aspect of the object into thinking it is something else. For instance, if a painting were to be left out in the rain, one could plausibly forge the painting into having not been left out in the rain. But to effectively accomplish this, the forger would have to know as much as possible about how and why the painting was left out in the rain, come up with a plausible explanation as to how, why, and when it was brought inside rather than being left out, and then successfully carve an alternate scenario into the stamp. The stamp is then inked with organic compounds and pressed into the ruined painting, preferably in a place that cannot be easily seen, which leaves an indent. The more plausible the explanation programmed into the stamp, the more likely it is to hold. If an object's cognitive aspect does not find the explanation believable, the seal will break and the object will revert back to its original form. This is why soul stamps are so highly reliant on a practitioner's knowledge of the object's history, so they can rewrite the object's history more plausibly. In much the same way Aeons are linked to the land of Opelon, the soul stamps involved in forgery are deeply connected to the land of Maipon, where the art of forging originates from. Indeed, every seal is affixed with a representation of Maipon on the reverse side of the carved stamp, which is necessary for the soul stamp to function. While individual symbols are unknown to us, each stamp is affixed with multitudes of varying symbols. These are used to program the stamp in much the same way Aeons draw upon the door in ways that are programmed. While investiture is involved in the art of forgery, in the end, very little is actually used. A forger is essentially just tricking an object into believing it's something that it's, well, not. The final magic system that we know of on Cell also originates within the Rose Empire, from the swampy land of Dajamar. It is a cousin of the Maipon art of forgery and is known as blood sealing. As you might have been able to guess from the name alone, the art of blood sealing requires human blood to ink their seals, as opposed to the bright organic compounds used in forgery. Blood sealing can be used to help imprison another individual, requiring a trapped individual's blood that will then be stamped onto a doorway. If the trapped individual exits the room, the blood sealer will know. This can also be somehow tied to their other known ability, skeletal awakening. It is unknown how this process works or even whose blood is used, but it is possible for a blood sealer to command small legions of skeletons through the use of their powers. I really hope we see more of these two arts in particular because I find both of them absolutely fascinating. But unfortunately, that's about all we know about them at the current time. It is unknown whether or not we'll be seeing any more of either in the sequels to Elantris, but Mr. Sanderson seems to be fond of forgery in particular, so I'd wager we glimpse more of this art in the future. Now that we know a little bit about every Cellish invested art, let's look at a few examples of them in action so that we can better understand how they work. Let's say you are an Elantrian. More specifically, an Elantrian wall guard that really wants some tea. But you're living in Elantris, a city with no shortage of food, water, or shelter, and honestly probably doesn't even need a wall guard in the first place. So, you decide to heat up your tea in the most convoluted way possible. Normal methods of heating aren't nearly enough for you. You're gonna draw upon the ancient, slumbering powers of the door to heat your water. You start off by drawing Aeon, the base for all other Aeons to build on. It resembles the natural landscape of Opelon and forges a connection to the door necessary to start building your program. Next, you draw a relatively complex program using Aeons, directing the power of the door into heating your metal pot to precisely 100 degrees Celsius. But you are also going to chain together a modifier onto the original Aeon to detect when the water inside your pot reaches boiling temperature. This will trigger the entire Aeon to shut itself off, disappearing from the air in front of you and leaving you with water that's the perfect temperature to brew your Elantrian tea. You sit back, relax, and think of the next program you'll needlessly construct. Maybe something having to do with closing the blinds. All this needless programming is making you feel like it's time for a nap. Next, let's travel to the Rose Empire and delve into the land of Maipon, where you just received a shipment of the finest Elantrian tea. It's a rarity since you're so darn far away from Elantris. Indeed, most of the people in this country don't even know what an Elantris is. Suckers. They have the best tea. You heat your water up like a normal person, but egads! When you go to pour the water into your cup, you accidentally break it. It's your only cup, but that's fine. You're a forger and can change your cup's history so that it was never broken in the first place. You painstakingly carve a stamp out of some soulstone you've got lying around, making sure to take into account the history of the cup, what material it's made of, how it was broken, and a plausible explanation as to how, actually, it didn't get broken. To finish it off, you carve a representation of the land of my pawn on the reverse of the stamp. You harden the stamp over your fire, ink it with your best organic squid ink, and press the stamp into the broken cup. The cognitive aspect of the cup draws power from the door, convincing its spiritual aspect that, yeah, that cup was totally never broken. The cognitive aspect of the cup can buy into that, sure. And voila, you have a cup again. You sip your tea and, oh gosh, it's cold. If only there was an easier way to heat water, Well, better buy a ridiculous amount of cups so that this never happens again. Our final example takes place back in Opelon, where we're traveling through the land of Jindo. You are a traveling Seons practicing cup salesman, and someone just bought out your entire stock. You're over the moon as it means you can finally afford some of that sweet Elantrian tea. Sure, you'll have to travel a ways, but you'll still be able to access your Seons magic dancing because you are relatively close to your homeland. However, when you get to Elantris, the gates are locked. All of the wall guards are busy boiling water, and their blinds are closed. How rude. You've been trying to afford this tea for years and determined that the best course of action is to just break down a small section of the wall and hunt down a merchant to sell you some tea. It really is that good. You start to build up speed and strength as you move through the circular forms of Seons, meditating on and focusing your strength as you slowly begin to access the door. You begin to glow as you build to a crescendo, unleashing a flurry of targeted strikes on the walls of Elantris. The wall crumbles under the might of your strength, and you step over the rubble to find the tea market. You finally purchase your tea, but nobody seems to have a cup. And that forger from my pawn just bought out your whole stock, as well as apparently every cup within the city of Elantris. Merciful Domi, what a nightmare! In this video, we have expanded upon our understanding of the Cosmere's overarching magic systems, the understanding of which is collectively referred to by scholars as realmatics. We have explored the concepts of connection and intention and how they relate to the door, the collected power of Cell's two shattered shards that have been trapped in Cell's cognitive realm. We've also taken a cursory look at every magic system on the planet and have explored a few systems further with examples of them in action. In the next video of this series, we'll be talking about a few new concepts and exploring how they relate to everything we know so far, using the planet of Roshar as a case study. Roshar has way too many magic systems and concepts to comfortably explore in one video, so our deep dive into Roshar's magic will be sliced into a few comfortable slices. I cannot wait to see you there. Merciful Domi, I've had fun exploring all that with you. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter and Instagram for some quality creme posting, as well as general updates. Have a fantastic day, folks. I'm gonna have to do research.